All right, let's bring in the chair of the Labour Party now and the Shadow Women and Equalities Secretary, Anneliese Dodds. Good morning to you, Anneliese Dodds. Thanks so much for being with us. I'm not going to get you to comment on exactly what Dominic Raab was talking about, as he says there's an ongoing process. I do want to talk to you, though, a little bit about some of the measures that he announced this morning about tougher sentences for people involved in domestic killings. Is that something that the Labour Party would welcome?
Well, of course, Labour will welcome any measure that will improve the safety of women and girls. But I have to say, we've seen really concerning developments over recent years here. If you look since 2015, we've seen prosecutions for domestic violence halve, while reports of domestic violence have more than doubled. So we need really serious action to be taken here. That's not just around sentencing, because actually, for very many domestic violence victims, they simply are not getting to that stage of anywhere near a prosecution. That's why, for example, we need to have domestic abuse specialists in every 999 control room. Labour's already delivered that, where we have a Labour Police and Crime Commissioner who's focused on improving that service for those victims. It's really important. We also need to see more specialist courts because we've got such a huge backlog around these kinds of crimes, and particularly crimes against women and girls. Again, we've called for specialist rape courts up and down the country to speed all of this up. Because as I say, for many women, they're not getting to that stage of sentencing. They're continuing to have to live in fear because of those many failures when it comes to both criminal justice, but also the policing system. I'm afraid that's been getting worse under
Yeah.
Conservative-led governments.
So how much extra money would the Labour Party, Labour government, put into the justice system?
Well, actually, if you look at the money currently that's being lost, I would say particularly to our economy, because of a failure to deal with crimes of domestic violence, we're talking absolutely enormous sums. That's because we're not dealing with these crimes properly at the beginning. So I don't think it's a question of just pumping more money into a system. It really is a question of making sure we get that response right. I've spoken with some women where they've repeatedly had to make calls on the police to stay safe. It's not been then properly joined up. And then we've seen terrible impacts for them continuing for a very long period of time. Now, we need to do far better around this. And many Labour police and crime commissioners are doing better. And they're managing to do that because they've been listening. They've been listening to the survivors of domestic abuse. And that, frankly, is what the Conservatives need to be doing right now.
Ms Dodds, you will have, of course, seen this morning, we heard from a nurse who is concerned about the pay offer that has been put forward for NHS workers from the government. It's 5% with a one-off pay deal. The Labour Party have never really said exactly how much they would have given to nurses. So do you think this deal's enough?
Well, that's because we don't want to see, ultimately, governments that focus on division, that are making up figures out of thin air, and that aren't negotiating. And unfortunately, the Conservatives refuse to negotiate, particularly with the nurses and with paramedics, for a really long time. Those nurses and paramedics offered to call off that industrial action, to not go ahead to strikes way back, right before Christmas. Now, if Conservative ministers had actually sat down with the nurses and paramedics back then, we wouldn't have seen, I think it's 140,000 operations and appointments being cancelled because of that industrial action. So the important thing here is negotiation. The Conservatives should have negotiated earlier with those nurses and paramedics. They need to be negotiating now with the junior doctors, not waiting, but sitting down with them today and getting a resolution to this. That is what's necessary. Under Labour governments, we didn't have a single strike that was a national
OK.
strike in the NHS. That's the
Ms Dodds,
difference between Labour and the
let me,
Tories.
let me just put it to you this way then. So the 5% is an offer with a one-off payment. You won't tell me exactly how much the Labour Party would put in, but would you be backing the unions, the GMB and the other unions, the RCN, in encouraging members to vote for this offer?
Well, the unions are currently speaking with their members. It's ultimately their decision. But no, I'm not going to state a figure out of thin air. Why? Because negotiation is what is important here. And if we'd seen that negotiation between Conservative ministers and NHS staff taking place when it needed to, when it was called for, and when those strikes could have been called off, we wouldn't have seen that negative impact on patients and all of those operations being cancelled.
So you'd be happy to see workers reject this pay offer and for strikes to continue?
I don't want strikes to continue. And in fact, Labour from the very beginning said the industrial action would be damaging. Nobody knows that more, actually, than patients and people working in the service, those NHS workers. That's why, when there was the opportunity for Conservative ministers to sit down with the nurses and paramedics before Christmas to get these strikes called off, Labour called on Conservative ministers to swallow their pride and actually negotiate. They refused to have those proper discussions back then. They took far too long. We saw a huge impact on our NHS, 140,000 operations and appointments being cancelled. And really, our patients and our NHS deserve better than that.
Okay, Anneliese Dodds, Chair of the Labour Party, to appreciate your time this morning. Thank you.